when they show up to vote. Experts fear this could lead to intimidation of legitimate voters. Despite the election experts' views, Republicans demanded new grounds for challenge, they said, to stop Democrats cheating.
We know that, and we know their party rests on the base of electoral fraud.
The answer came from the man known as Bush's brain, Karl Rove, who demanded new ID voting laws.
I go to the grocery store and I want to cash a check to pay for my groceries. I got to show a little bit of ID. Why should it not be reasonable and responsible to say that when people show up at the voting place, they ought to be able to prove who they are by showing some form of ID?
New ID laws will hit black voters hardest, says Robert F. Kennedy, Jr., son of the late Attorney General and voting rights lawyer. You know, Karl Rove said he goes to a grocery store, he has to show an ID to cash a check. So why can't you be required to show a photo ID when you vote for President of the United States? That seems sensible. However, in America, it raises a racial issue.
I have an ID, and most Americans have an ID, but 1 out of every 10 Americans don't have a government-issued ID because they don't travel abroad, so they don't have passports, and they don't drive a car, so they don't have driver's licenses. The number rises to 1 in 5 when you're dealing with the African-American community.
Altogether, an estimated 100,000 black voters in just one swing state, Indiana, will lose their vote to the new law. But when I stopped by the Native American pueblos of New Mexico, I discovered that when it comes to voter suppression, Democrats don't have clean hands either. Local politicians wanted to reopen a uranium mine on the Pueblo's sacred mountain. The Pueblos were not happy.
See, that's a very secret mountain that we have. There is a place, special place that we pray for to have a nice summer, have good rain.
The officials gave the Pueblos ballots without envelopes. Then these same politicians threw out their votes because they didn't come in the right envelopes. The Democrats were charged with cheating the Pueblos by this man, David Iglesias, a rising Republican star appointed U.S. prosecutor by George Bush. But the Bush administration wanted him to go after individual Democrat voters. Republicans bombarded Iglesias with allegations of fraud by Democrats.
Over 100 complaints. We investigated for almost 2 years. I didn't find one prosecutable voter fraud case in the entire state of New Mexico.
So the Bush administration fired him. Not prosecuting innocent people led to your removal?
Yeah, I mean, they wanted some splashy pre-election indictments that would scare these alleged hordes of illegal voters away. They're looking for improperly politicized U.S. attorneys to file bogus voter fraud cases.
In the last presidential election, officially, 3 million votes were cast and never counted. This time, it could go a lot higher. And then there's the chronic shortage of voting machines. In Ohio last time, voters in prosperous white neighborhoods waited only 15 minutes to vote, while voters in poor black areas waited in line 4 hours. It all adds up, and it can change the outcome.
If you combine people who are disenfranchised by voter ID, people who are disenfranchised by other things, such as there not being enough voting machines, combined with people who will be shut out because they have been left off the voter registration list, that's enough to swing the election.
If the final count is as close as the polls indicate, the next man in that house won't be chosen by counting the votes, but by blocking the voters.
A report on voting rights filed by investigative journalist Greg Palast for BBC Newsnight. When we come back from break, he joins us live. Then we'll be talking to the Secretary of State of Ohio and find out about a new report on voter purging around the country. Stay with us.
We want voting representation. 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 Voting representation. We want voting representation. We want voting representation. 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 Voting representation.
We want the vote here on Democracy Now!, Sweet Honey in the Rock. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Greg Palast, BBC investigative reporter, joins us here in our Firehouse studio, author of Our Madhouse, as well as The Best Democracy Money Come By and Democracy and Regulation. Right now, he's teamed up with Robert F. Kennedy Jr. to investigate this year's election. They've just released a voting guide comic book called Steal Back Your Vote. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Greg Palast.
Glad to be here. Let's see how many we can steal back.
And your piece is coming out in Rolling Stone next week. Just summarize what we just watched. What you found as you traveled the country, the most egregious problems of people taken off the voting rolls.
Well, that's the problem, is that we have millions and millions and millions of people being purged off the voter rolls. Like in the state of Colorado, it was stunning to find out that 1 in 5 voters had their names simply erased by the Republican Secretary of State. And then George Bush picked her out and made her the head of the U.S. Elections Assistance Commission. As you know, our joke in the comic book is that Bush wanted to name her Purgeon General, but Rove said it was a bit too much. So this is one of the big problems. You're going to have millions of people walk into the voting booth. If you're in Colorado, especially New Mexico, Nevada, Ohio, Michigan, if you have any foreclosure problems, anything, they're going to tell you you can't vote. And they're going to try to either get you out of the voting booth or give you a provisional ballot. And what we're trying to tell you is how you can, in effect, steal it back. So, look, Kennedy and I are coming out with a expose in Rolling Stone next week on the massive theft of the vote in November. And we were kind of shaken up about it because Jesse Jackson recommended to us that, look, that's so grim, you're going to discourage people from voting. They're going to say there's no chance. So you got to do something. So what we did is facing a democracy crisis in America, we did what you have to do, which is to create a comic book. And it's 24 pages of full color with the idea that it gives you the Rolling Stone story with Ted Rall and other great comics laying it out, but then also telling you how you steal it back. And so we have 6 ways that they're stealing the election, but then 7 ways you can steal it back.
Well, one of the things that we were talking as the film was playing, you're not often getting Democratic leaders in some of these states really raising a ruckus about this issue. Oh, yeah. And why is that? In terms of your investigations, for instance, in New Mexico, you mentioned that some of the Democratic leaders were willing to go along with these kinds of purges.
Well, as why don't Democrats stand up for the same reason as jellyfish? They don't, invertebrates. But or as my co-author Kennedy said, they're cowards. But he's true blue. I'm not a Democrat. And by the way, the guide is totally nonpartisan, which means you can take it into the booth with you, by the way, to protect yourself, to steal back your vote comic. And why don't the Democrats protect voters? Because they're in on the game. As you saw in New Mexico, you had Democratic Party officials knocking off the Native American vote, which is huge in New Mexico. It's a swing vote in New Mexico. And they're all Democrats, Native Americans, almost to a 1. But they wanted to stop a uranium mine locally. And so the local Poles who want their bakshish from the uranium mine